Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach, and I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. William Howell, to talk about the crisis in American democracy. Dr. Howell, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
Dr. Howell is the Sidney Stein Professor in American Politics at the University of Chicago. He's the director of the Center for Effective Government and co-host of Not Another Politics podcast. And in 2020, he published a book called The Crisis in Democracy. Dr. Howell, get us started talking about this. What is the crisis? How do you see that?
Well, this is a book that's trying to think about the rise of populism in American politics and the challenges that it presents to democracy. And the challenges work on lots of different fronts. And it might be worth, just to get us started, to get some clarity about what we mean by populism.
Yeah, I know populism was a concern of the framers of the Constitution, and they thought they built some checks and balances in there to keep it at bay. Should we start historically with this? Or?
Sure,
okay.
Sure. Yeah, the framers were deeply concerned about the masses, their ability to reason, their ability to engage in politics, and the possibility that through the passions of the mob that we would drive our country into a ditch. And they built in all these protections, separation of powers,
right.
Foremost among them, but many others, staggered elections.
Yeah, the staggered elections, I think, are something that really makes this pretty clear. They wanted the people elected to Congress to be elected every 2 years to make them stay tuned in to public opinion, essentially. But then they have senators elected every 6 years and Supreme Court justices appointed for life to insulate them from it. Is that correct?
Yes. And in the House, in the Senate, they're elected every 6 years, but only a third of them are up for election in any electoral cycle, which again is by way of making sure that in no one particular moment can popular sentiment grab hold of the entirety of government and direct it down one path or another. Populism, though, is not just about the expression of the people, at least as scholars write about it.
And this is, in the context that we're talking about it, populism is a pejorative term here.
That's right.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
We're not talking about like popular music and things like that.
No. And nor are we talking about populism as it's colloquially often referred to as, which is like the little guy finally getting his say.
Right. Yeah.
Right. I believe in populism because I believe that people who are at the margins ought to be brought to the center. Right. The way that scholars often talk about populism is it's an actual movement. It's a rhetorical device, and it has a playbook, and it goes roughly like this. What the populist argues is that our politics, through and through, are broken. Right. They're through and through.
Right.
They're discredited, they're corrupt. Everything about it is rotten to the core. And the populace brandishes it's usually a he, brandishes his credentials by saying, I sit apart from that catastrophe. I'm an outsider.
And I can fix things.
And I can fix things.
Now,
It's because I'm an outsider that I can fix things.
Now, when you say there's a playbook, that's because this goes all the way back at least to Andrew Jackson, right?
For sure. There's a long history in the United States of this happening. You see Andrew Jackson making these kinds of appeals.
Right.
But there's a much sort of more vibrant history of populism in Latin America. There's a number of populist parties in Western Europe have taken hold.
Yeah.
And what the book tries to do is to try to make sense of, well, why did it grab hold of our presidential politics, our national politics, in 2016 through Trump in the way that they did. And a core part of the argument that we lay out in the book is that the reason why these kinds of claims take hold is in the aftermath of sustained periods of government failure. That is, there are wishes and wants that a public has. They would like to see certain problems addressed, and routinely the government struggles to do so. And that then raises questions, if you want to get serious about addressing the challenges that populism presents. Because your point earlier about I can fix it, that's in an important way profoundly anti-democratic. Because it's saying, not just I can fix it, I alone can fix it. Vest your hopes and aspirations in me, not in these institutions, these democratic, small d democratic institutions that we've built.
So we see this argument, just to touch base historically a little more, with Andrew Jackson, with William Jennings Bryan.
For sure.
Cross of Gold speech, things like that. That's around 19...
It's the late 19th century.
Late 19th century, okay. And then in my lifetime, I associate them with Ronald Reagan running in 1980, kind of running against the government.
Yeah, it is. It has this piece to it, which is, it's a slight distinction to be had here,
okay,
which is worth having. I wouldn't call Reagan a populist in that he wasn't to his core anti-institutional. He was for limited government. He saw the government as it was constituted in 1980 as a problem that needed to be reined in. But he didn't say things like, vest all your hopes and aspirations in me, I alone can fix it, which is the move that a populist makes. A populist is not just offering a deep critique of an existing order, it's saying, let's not reshape it.
So there's an element of demagoguery here.
For sure. And it's about personal power, the assertion of personal power.
So the demagogue says, I'm protecting you from all of these problems here.
And look to me.
Look to me, yeah.
Look to me at every turn. I'm the one who can be trusted. I'm the one who can do.
Right. That was not Reagan. I'll give you that. Yeah.
Yeah. He said, don't trust the government, right? We need to curtail the government.
Right.
But he wasn't.
And he was belittling to Jimmy Carter in the debates, as I recall. Didn't
this
show a
is-
lot of
this is
respect for the presidency.
This is true.
Yeah.
But this is a more common feature of our politics more generally.
Now it is, yeah.
Yeah, for sure, in this polarized era.
Yeah.
So the populist comes in and makes these kinds of claims, and you can see then the strains on democracy when the move is to say, don't trust Congress, don't trust the parties, don't trust the media, believe only in me. That's the stuff of a democracy unwinding.
And your main example of this, I assume, is Trump.
Yes, and it's trying to make sense of where Trump comes from, and what a response to Trump might look like. And I want to be clear, this is not an argument about him assuming the wrong policies or staking out positions that are misguided. This is about populism and the force that it plays in our politics,
right?
And how we might respond to it.
Do you see this populist impulse among the public as something that's always there that occasionally comes to the front, or do you see it as something that's generated by? I mean, you mentioned there are times when government fails to solve problems. Does that generate it, or does that just sort of make it more accessible?
No, this is an important feature of it. So you see in the 1890s a widespread concern that the government wasn't up to the task of meeting modern problems, and populism beginning to take hold. The response, though, was the progressive movement. You saw it, right? And then again with the Great Depression. And in the 1930s, there was this fervent about, do we have the right system?
So was Teddy Roosevelt a bit of a populist then?
Yeah, a bit. I mean, he was a progressive. He was a progressive in that he recognized this populist fervent and said, we need to respond to it. We need to do something in response to it. He then doesn't claim that, vest all powers, all aspirations, all hopes in me.
Yeah.
And so what you see in the progressive movement, we also see in the New Deal as a response to the Great Depression, which is another moment where populism was ascending, is a government response trying to attend to the needs and wants and wishes of a people. What you see now with the rise of globalization and a sense that there are communities, manufacturing communities that have been drained, widespread displacement through technological developments of jobs, big immigration shifts have introduced profound challenges that our government has struggled to address over a long period of time, which has led to stagnant wages, which has led to widespread anxiety that the populace, that Trump had the foresight to see politically he could tap into and say, you know what, you're right, the government has failed you, and it's failed you because it doesn't care about you. I do. I stand to be your champion.
It's interesting that you're looking at economic issues mainly here. We're not talking about global warming. We're not talking about some of the social issues that the government hasn't dealt with very well either.
No, those are live issues too.
Yeah.
They haven't, thus far, we haven't seen the immediate effect of global climate change on the loss of jobs and the loss of sense of identity in certain kinds of communities.
So the prime mover in all of this is going to be the economic impact that things are having.
I mean, there is. We talk about in the book also these cultural ones. There are issues about race and identity that play out, particularly as they're tied up in issues involving immigration.
Yeah.
But again, the struggles of the government to pass and implement a coherent immigration system to meet the challenges of globalization laid the groundwork, we argue, for widespread anger, disaffection, discontent that then a populace could tap into.
So let's talk about how that happened then with Trump.
So Trump sees this.
Yeah.
He, unlike any of the other conventional conservatives who are running for the Republican nomination in 2016, makes his case and captures the imagination of a core part of his base. That the Republican Party at the time struggled mightily to redirect. They had plenty of conventional Republicans up for election, and none of them could grab hold because the moment was ripe.
And he articulated it better than the others, you think?
I mean, he articulated not just the problem, but I think he tapped into the anger. The sort of the sense that, you know what, our system is broken. It is in important ways corrupt. It doesn't address the needs and wants that I and my family, my community have. And he was able to tap into that in a really profound way.
Could we go as far as to say that he personified it in some way, that they saw him as sort of representing them just in terms of the way he talked and acted?
I think that's there's a performative quality to the presidency that he tapped into, and he would mock both at rallies and on the campaign trail the traditional modes of presidential presentation and say, I'm not that. I'm not that. I can do that, but I'm not that, and that's why you should believe in me.
Yeah, I teach public relations, and something that's come up when I'm lecturing is students will say to me, well, because I was lecturing while all of this was going on over the last 10 years here, right? And people would say, well, how's he still in the race? Because I'm talking about you say certain things, you damage your reputation, and you're out. I talk about Gary Hart and things like that, and here's Trump, who just says one incredibly damaging thing after another, and he's just as popular as he ever was. He just rides it out, and he gets elected president.
One is it brandishes his credentials as an outsider, and a truth speaker, and one who just sort of lays it out there, even as he lies at every turn, right? But he's able to say, like, I'm not cut from that cloth, and you wouldn't want somebody to, because again, my message is it's all broken, it's all corrupt. There's that piece. Then, to the extent that there is a response repeatedly by the opposition that's saying, I'm going to come for you, it in a funny way allows him to come out and say, you see how craven the opposition is? They will stop at no ends to protect themselves. To be clear, Trump, to my mind at least, is every bit as strategic as Biden, as Clinton.
Oh, you think so?
For sure. He knows what he's doing. This is a popular playbook, what he's playing from. It is one that isn't just working for him by virtue of his own insight, but has worked for populists around the globe. That they come in with a certain amount of swagger, they brandish their outsider credentials, and...
Well, he's a fascinating subject.
He really is.
Let's take this in a slightly different direction here. So certainly Trump took politics in a different direction by being so populist in his appeal here. How has that changed the presidency? How has that changed future elections, or has it?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that it's profoundly changed the Republican Party. He stood at the edges of the party in 2016, and it is clear he sits squarely at the center.
He proved that, absolutely.
Right, and also what proved it is the responses of all of the folks who are perfectly willing to reiterate his claims about election fraud, who dare not call him out, even as they run against him, who want to champion his core beliefs at every turn. And he, even somebody who's twice impeached and is facing 91 indictments and is going to be spending much of the next time.
This isn't supposed to be able to happen.
It's not supposed to happen. And yet, it's quite clear he's going to be the nominee, and nobody can find their way in. How did that come to be? And
Yeah.
to my mind, it came to be because this is something much larger than Trump. He tapped into something really profound, these populist sentiments.
Yeah.
And it has reshaped the party, and it stands to reshape the presidency, particularly should he get reelected. The moves that he made were not just rhetorical moves. They had to do with the politicization of the administrative state, which is something we can talk about. It had to do with pushing back against traditional norms that have governed both Republican and Democratic presidents in shaping how they behave in office. And in important ways, I think what he promises to do, and he promises to do this, this isn't about reading between the lines, it's about taking him seriously what he actually says, is he's going to harness all the powers available to him in order
That's a frightening challenge,
It is.
Yeah.
It really is. To push back on any legislative or judicial checks that will be put before him.
Right.
And that's the stuff of an unwinding democracy. And that's where we can look to other countries. You look to what's happened in Hungary or in Turkey or in South American countries where through a small d, democratically elected president, they claimed all kinds of powers just as they try to delegitimize those who would check their power in order to roll back a democracy.
Well, how bad can that get for us in America? I mean, it's hard to imagine our country becoming a dictatorship. What would happen? How would
it's
how would
not
that
as
go, how
hard
would that
to
play
imagine
out?
as it was a decade ago. I think you see how close we got with January 6th, and had there not been
But was January
set of-
6th really a threat? Was it that much of a threat?
I think the unwillingness of a sitting president to recognize that he had lost, and at the same time, a majority of the members of the House to vote against the certification of the votes, and the sustained efforts to put forward alternative electors, those are stuff when you see abroad, you say that's the stuff of democracy unwinding.
Yeah, no,
we
you're
should
right.
really be
You're
worrying about that.
You're right.
So
it's not so much the crowds that were roaming through the streets of Washington D.C. as it is the reaction of the people who should have been the cooler heads, as they say, right?
And there were a few key people who kept it together. I think we came closer than we would like to believe to being in a real constitutional crisis. And so take Trump again at his own terms. What he's saying is right now, I will be your retribution. I will go after our political enemies. I will lay waste to the administrative state. I will marshal all the powers of the federal government in order to. This is
Caesar crossing the Rubicon.
This is serious stuff. This is serious stuff.
Just quickly, who do you think kind of kept it in check?
It wasn't anyone. It was both. I think it was really important that Pence goes through and refuses to do Trump's bidding when it comes to the certification of the votes. I think there are a set of election administrators, particularly in Georgia, that refuse to respond to his appeal to produce 11,000 votes, or to offer up an alternative slate, or to affirm that his claims that the vote was fraudulent, that played an instrumental role. And then there also were, the court cases all over the place. You could imagine any one judge coming forward and saying, you know what, there's something to these kinds of arguments. And we shouldn't believe it's not just the significance of that ruling, but what it would set in motion and what it would validate. It could have altered the course of the 2020 election in important ways.
So what do you think we need to do to kind of move the country back away from this precipice here and not?
It's really hard. There's no one answer to this. I'll say a thing that we point to in the book that we try to lay out is the work of institutional reform in the service of a more effective government. Like, we need a government that's actually capable of meeting the needs and wants and attending to the anxieties of the public. And we don't clearly have that. In important ways, it really is true, we argue, that Congress is ill-equipped to meet modern challenges. And the courts are ill-equipped to do so. And we need to then think anew about how to reconstitute not just the presidency, but how the president interacts with Congress, which is going to involve lots of institutional reforms. We need a new progressive movement, not to sort of borrow all their changes and just import them into the modern age, but to say we need to rethink our institutions if what we're going to do is get onto more solid ground. As long as we have a government that fails to solve problems that the public wants to see solved, we're going to be in trouble.
In order to do anything that would have that broad and deep of an impact, we'd have to have some really foundational shift here, don't you think?
For sure. For sure. The previous book, this book that I wrote, President's Populism and the Crisis of Democracy, which I wrote with Terry Moe.
Yeah.
The previous book was called Relic, and it was all about how our inheritances, our institutional political inheritances from the Constitution, in important ways, do not put us in good standing when we think about meeting modern challenges.
Just to make this a little more, accessible here in terms of what we're talking about, I mean, do you think something like a parliamentary form of government should be considered? Is that categorically the kind of thing that we should be looking at? Yeah.
Yeah. In the book, we say that is something we should look at, but it's a bridge too far. Like politically, there's no chance of us getting there, and so we say there's real merit in those arguments, but that we try to think anew about how we might change the legislative process, how we might check certain presidential powers, the pardon power, the politicization of the administrative state, these kinds of things, that will put us into a space where the threat of presidential power isn't quite so acute, but where we stand a chance of actually meeting modern challenges. We actually get to the place where we can solve problems. And so we roll out, in the last chapter of the book, a set of institutional reforms that might attend to it.
And some of those are what? Give us some suggestions.
I'll give you two.
Okay.
So the one that would enhance presidential power is that we ought to give the power to the president to be able to introduce legislation to Congress, and that Congress then should have to vote on it. That's not something the president is able to do right now. They depend upon legislators who are parochial and short-term in their orientation, and that this would...
You have to negotiate and horse trade with them in order to get things through, yeah.
Right. The president ought to be able to come forward and say, here's a proposal on immigration reform. Vote on it. You can vote it down, but you've got to vote on it.
Yeah.
That's a reform we would like to see happen, which would be an expansion of presidential power.
Teddy Roosevelt would love that.
I think most presidents would love it. An important check would be the number of political appointees that they make. Presidents now make thousands of political appointees, appointments, and that is...
And often don't get them all done.
Yeah. It creates all kinds of churn. There's learning loss. It creates disincentives for people who are lifelong civil servants to make investments in expertise. We'd like to reduce the number of political appointees that presidents make.
And that's it?
Oh, there are more. Get rid of the pardon power. There are a host of things. But it's all our effort in this book to try to ask those foundational questions, those institutional questions.
I think that's good.
Reimagine our institutions.
And it gets the conversation going. Are you conceding then that there's always going to be this kind of anti-establishment, maybe anti-intellectual sediment in society that can be tapped to empower a demagogue who's appealing to them?
That is an enduring feature of our political heritage. That's for sure true.
So it comes with democracy.
I think it for sure does.
Yeah.
When you have a government that routinely fails to solve problems, those latent sentiments can become manifest. They can spill over. They can boil over. That's what we're observing in our politics today. And so we would do well to try to get serious and reform our institutions so that we do a better job of solving problems.
Jürgen Habermas writes about where this is all going, and he didn't spell it out necessarily that way, but he kind of used the French principles as something that maybe everybody should consider, the fraternity and those kinds of issues. I mean, do you think there's maybe without looking at this as a legal system, do you think there's maybe a set of values that we need to acknowledge that would guide us as we're retooling things?
For sure, and I think one of the challenges in this present age is to figure out how to articulate those values that allow a highly polarized, a fractious and angry public to come together and recognize themselves as common citizens with a shared fate. That's the stuff of political leadership, and we need it.
And I think that's one of the problems with populism, because it tends to articulate values that aren't functional, that aren't going to survive.
It's about stoking anger and
Yeah.
disaffection
Yeah.
and a sense of grievance, which burns hot and bright, but it's hard to sustain us as a people for the long haul in those embers.
That's all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Dr. William Howell for joining me today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. See you next time.